our next session, we are looking to tackle another essential topic: Asia's regional outlook on the future of fossil fuels. For this session, I'd like to introduce and welcome on stage, firstly, Purva Jain, IEEFA's energy specialist, gas and international advocacy, who will be leading the discussion. Panelists for this session include Christopher Dolman, an LNG gas specialist for IEEFA, Tong Jae Oh, head of oil and gas at Solutions for Our Climate, Gi Pei, an energy finance specialist focusing on Asia coal markets at IEEFA, together with Eleanor Whittle, CMM Program Director at EMBA. As with previous sessions, once again, we say hello to everyone joining us online on the Hoover app, and also remind everyone in person to direct all your questions via the Hoover app, which of course Purva will be moderating a little later in the session. Purva, the time is yours. Over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here, and welcome to the plenary session, Asia's Regional Outlook on the Future of Fossil Fuels. We are joined on stage by an extremely distinguished panel that I'm sure will lead to a very invigorating and insightful discussion for all of us today. Throughout this session, we will evaluate the role LNG and coal will play in meeting Asia's energy needs and the associated risks and challenges of this dependency. In the preceding session, we learned just how critical is Asia's decarbonization for the global climate crisis. Dr. Ghosh correctly pointed out to the need to balance development with decarbonization, a critical challenge for Asia, and the urgent need to focus on this challenge, even if it's just from an economic standpoint. Given Asia's specificities, transitioning away from fossil fuels will encompass a considerably different approach than the other regions of the world. But we must not forget and underestimate the risks of price volatility, energy security, potential stranded assets, and hampering of renewable energy deployment that come with pushing more fossil fuels. Like Vibhuti and Christoph said in the last session, that the time is now for action, and that holds utmost true for fossil fuels, as every decision we take for adding more fossil fuels capacity, we will be locking in more financial resources and taking potential finance away from clean fuels. Many Asian nations indeed have set an ambitious net zero target and committed to an increase in renewable energy assets. Considerable growth has also been witnessed with the installed renewable energy capacity, growing almost tenfold from the early 2000s. We have come a long way, but the actual electricity supply is still skewed towards traditional forms of power, with almost fossil fuels contributing to almost 70% generation in Asia. In our session today, we will discuss the challenges of electricity generation from LNG and coal and their feasibility in Asia's energy mix, especially given the price sensitivity of these countries and the increasing import reliance of these fuels. With targeted and strategic incremental shifts to renewables, we can gain considerable ground for Asia's decarbonization journey. This and more will be unpacked in the subsequent sessions over the 2 days, while today you join us to discuss the role of LNG and coal. This discussion will lead us to answers on the marketability of LNG in Asia, stranded asset risks of LNG and coal assets, problems of underestimating methane emissions, and the cost economics of fossil fuels. So before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to invite Chris to give us a presentation on the Global Energy Outlook and IEEFA flagship report. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Purva. Elephants, dragons, and ET. It's going to be tough to top that, but I'll give it a shot. So, over the next 8 minutes or so, I'll try to paint a mosaic about why IEEFA, we believe that LNG markets are headed towards a period of oversupply, and it's going to be pretty difficult for the Asia Pacific to absorb that surplus. Yeah, so we're in an LNG supercycle, the largest growth phase in the sector's history. On top of capacity expansions from the US and Qatar, we're expecting liquefaction capacity to grow 40% by 2028, and production from those facilities will start to outstrip demand over the next 2 years, putting downward pressure on spot prices. At the same time, we're expecting demand from legacy markets to start to hit structural decline. So in Europe, following the energy crisis, there's been a lot of demand destruction, and there's policy put in place to wean the region off of gas. And in Japan and South Korea, we're expecting basically declines to come from higher nuclear availability from restarts in Japan and more reactors from Korea, as well as higher renewable output and some demographic factors. So what does this mean? Well, emerging Asia is going to need to absorb not just higher supply, but also this surplus left over from legacy markets. Now, proponents like Shell would argue that this is easy. Demand is latent in this region. If the supply emerges, demand will just manifest. Our view is that demand, it's going to be a bit harder. We don't really share that view. When you look at these emerging markets, they're fundamentally different than your traditional buyers. So I'll get into a few reasons why. One is basically wealth. The emerging LNG importers do not have the fiscal coffers, the monetary reserves, or the end-user wealth or incomes that would give them the capacity to absorb the whims of the LNG price movements that are inherent to the sector. And during economic crises and energy crises, their currencies tend to depreciate, which exacerbates that affordability issue. Two timelines. If you're banking on, say, Vietnam's power development plan to grow LNG demand, you should know that they still haven't signed an PPA for an LNG to power plant, and also it takes upwards of 10 years from the onset to completion for a thermal PPA to be finalized there. And lastly, reliability. I think a lot of these emerging countries, emerging LNG importers are starting to question the reliability of LNG. In Bangladesh, the floating liquefaction terminals have had a lot of reliability issues in inclement weather. And in Pakistan has proven that even if you have a long-term contract, that will not be reliable when you need the gas the most. So yeah, I talked about prices falling due to oversupply. You're probably thinking, well, then wouldn't demand rise? Sure, we're not expecting demand to not increase, but we're also expecting supply to respond. And really, if you start to look at the landed cost of delivering a flexible cargo into Asia, if that's lower than the spot price, then in the long run, you would expect some cargo cancellations. So during the pandemic, we saw that happen when prices started to fall below $6 per MMBTU. A floor so that could put in a price floor, and a floor at that level is not really conducive to trigger the long-term demand response that would be predicated on coal to gas substitution, meaning the LNG prices just aren't low enough to compete with coal in the region. If you just sort of combine China's coal and gas supply curves for 2023, you can see that LNG would need to fall to like that orange level, about $5 per MMBTU to compete on an economic basis. So it's just not really economic. But switching to China in general, talking about why the coal to gas substitution narrative there doesn't really hold water. It's not really consistent with Chinese energy policy. For energy security, China wants to bank on coal, not gas, for electrical reliability and energy security. Also, there's a desire to limit gas imports to under 50% of demand requirements in China. However, I should touch on the fact that LNG has been displacing liquid fuels in China, particularly diesel and heavy-duty vehicles and LPG and city gas networks, as well as in some industrial applications. And if oil prices are about where they are now, and LNG prices are now where they are now or lower, I mean, that economic narrative is going to hold, and you could see some higher demand coming from liquid displacement, not just in China, but across Asia. So that's something to consider going forward. So historically, over the last 10 years, we've seen portfolio players or LNG middlemen sort of be instrumental in unlocking a lot of LNG supply by signing long-term purchase agreements with prospective liquefaction facilities, giving them a viability to get an FID and start construction. However, a lot of these middlemen have not been basically covering their purchases with offtake agreements. They're increasingly just sort of leaving, like right now, about half of that uncovered and exposed to the spot market, which could, instill a lot of risk for any of these players if you're expecting an LNG glut to come along. But there's also another thing that could make it a little more risky, and that's that the traditional buyers of this LNG are now starting to become their competitors. So Japan's probably the most transparent example. The government's been very active at saying, well, we're expecting demand to fall. However, to maintain our influence on the LNG sector, please, they're instructing companies and utilities to maintain their handling volumes at current levels, which is around 100 megatons out to 2030. So we're expecting that right now, Japan's selling about 30 megatons to overseas countries of the volumes it handles. That could grow to 50 megatons by 2030 if demand falls like we're expecting. So if you're, this could further depress prices, and if you're basically one of these portfolio players, you'd be exposed to competing with not, one of your traditional buyer, long-term and best customers. Yeah, so I guess just wrapping up. We're expecting oversupply to emerge this decade, and also legacy importers to enter structural decline. We think it will be challenging for the emerging LNG markets in Southeast Asia and China to absorb this surplus for a lot of reasons that I outlined earlier. Lower prices will have a demand response, but supply will respond too, which will sort of prevent a coal to gas substitution occurring in the region, at a material coal to gas substitution. And lastly, the encroachment of merchant utilities into this portfolio space will make it risky for any sort of player that is exposed to spot markets. So with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Chris. I think you were well within time. Just based off your presentation, a quick question. So you spoke about potential supply glut for LNG with the emerging players expected to absorb that surplus. Are there any developments, any recent developments that you think can change this narrative? And what does it say for the LNG-related energy security concerns for the Asian markets?
Hello? Yeah, okay, yeah. I guess there has been some, reliability issues with some LNG supply. That's, that could mean that our outlook came out in April. So it could be that we're not seeing as much supply coming on, but I think that sort of just pushes the thesis out, doesn't really change the thesis. Another thing would be, there's been deferrals, like Golden Pass LNGs having a 6-month deferral due to construction issues. Again, I don't really think that changes the thesis, just defers it. I think one thing would be the demand narrative that I sort of talked about in terms of this liquid fuel displacement. If that starts to take off, not just in China, but across Asia, that could maybe derail our thesis. And I think another thing could be whatever goes on with data centers, AI, that whole discussion, semiconductors. And again, it's not even just about if that happens, it's about where it could potentially happen. And if, because if it happens in a supplying region, that could also, you could get higher prices in the United States, for example, or you could get, have difficulty feeding, these LNG terminals, which would, obviously be an energy security risk. But I think, it would challenge our low price sort of assumption. But also it would depend on if renewables and batteries and other, alternatives could sort of rise to meet that emerging demand.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to bring in Guy now. Guy, how we are thinking about, there is a potential LNG supply glut. There is also a planned expansion of coal capacity, diversification of coal resources planned across Asia, and which, of course, not only have environmental risks, but also brings in a lot of financial risks because it, how I mentioned earlier, it locks in the financial resources for fossil fuels. So what do you think are the challenges of this trend? And various banks have already committed to not invest in coal assets. Do you think that has had any positive impact?
Okay, thank you, Purba. I guess to answer your question first with the banks, the good news is that it's very difficult to get bank financing for anything coal-related today. Yeah. Just example, Adaro is building aluminium plant that includes a coal plant for the phase one, and DBS, Standard Chartered, pulled it out of the financing, even though theoretically it's an aluminium smelter, but because there's a coal plant attached to it, that's part of their commitment, right? So it's quite difficult to get financing for coal-related sort of assets today. The bad news is that in Indonesia's case, we were talking about this in the critical minerals session tomorrow, is that if a coal plant is attached, it's a captive coal plant, it is not a coal plant because it doesn't count towards the coal plant capacity. So it's a taxonomy issue. Yeah, thanks.
Do you want to also, you have 2 slides that you want to show, so do you want to do that now? And then I can go to Eleanor. Alex?
Okay, so the good news, if you don't like coal, the good news is that people don't want to finance it anymore. So it's got to the stage where if you are trying to invest in a coal plant, you need to go to private sources of funding. So think of it this way, it's a very profitable business, but you don't want people to know you're doing it, right? So it's like a Donald Trump t-shirt, it's very profitable. So what's interesting is that there's only 2 Indonesian companies out of 7 we analyze that are actually expanding coal capacity. The other 5 are not. So the message is definitely getting through. We're not going to mention those companies by name yet. And then the whole issue of captive coal plants, big problem, because according to the taxonomy, a captive coal plant is not a coal plant. That's right. A captive coal plant is not a coal plant. Even though it burns coal and you're emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, it's not a coal plant. Now, anybody with a spouse, kids, or parents will know what I mean. Yep, and then let's go to the second slide. So we can tell that the message is getting through because we wrote a report, and out of 7 Indonesian coal companies, only 2 of them are expanding capacity by more than 100%. And you can tell that, I'm not going to mention those 2 companies, but Adaro, Harum, Indica, ITMG, and PTBA are not expanding capacity. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks, Guy. I'd like to bring in Eleanor now. So, Eleanor, a big risk with coal LNG is that it underestimates the methane emissions. Could you elaborate on why there is an urgent need for an increased awareness on coal methane emissions?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity for bringing up this important topic. So, when we talk about coal in the fossil fuel debate, we're always thinking about the carbon emissions at the end stage. But as you've alluded to, what we always forget are the emissions earlier in the process. And these are the significant methane emissions at the mining stage. So methane has 30 times the warming power of carbon dioxide. So we can't ignore these emissions. But actually, in the case of coal, they're rarely ever reported or even properly measured, especially when we consider net zero plans and investment decisions. And actually, many countries are probably significantly underestimating their methane emissions from coal, and also then potentially underestimating the overall footprint of coal. So when we look at the future of fossil fuels in Asia, if we consider these coal mine methane emissions, it obviously further strengthens the case for accelerating the transition to renewables from a climate perspective, but also from a human health and an investment perspective, especially since many of the biggest coal mine methane emitters are in the Asia-Pacific region. So we already know that technologies exist today to mitigate 50% of these coal mine methane emissions globally. But also dealing with methane in the energy sector is one of the most cost-effective ways to deal with climate change in the near term. And the IEA has said that coal mine methane needs to be reduced by 75% by 2030 to be on track for 1.5. Obviously, that doesn't give us very long. And through the research we do at EMBA, we want to show what solutions are available and the opportunities for countries and also companies to uphold their climate commitments. And at the moment, many of these commitments are being undermined by not accounting for this significant emission source. Thanks.
So I would like to follow up on that. I think methane emissions are accelerating climate change, and that is one thing that is also not really considered and talked about. According to an EMBA analysis, you say that the methane emissions, the impact on climate change can be equivalent to the CO2 impact of the climate change impact of India and even US. So what do you think are the risks and missed opportunities in undercalculating and underestimating this?
Yeah, thank you. So in the case of Indonesia, for example, only 4 out of 10 of the biggest coal companies included coal mine methane emissions in their sustainability reports. So it means that companies' existing net zero commitments are being undermined by the fact that coal mine methane is missing from existing targets and mitigation plans. And obviously this shows hidden environmental and investment risks. And our research also found that coal mine methane could actually double these companies' reported emissions. But if these are not being properly accounted for, then the companies can't be sure they're actually complying with national and international standards or appropriately considering these investment and operational risks. And then in the case of India, for example, if India's planning to double their coal production this decade, they're already one of the biggest coal mine methane emitters. So obviously this poses a considerable risk to their domestic emissions reduction plans. And actually we have a report coming out shortly that looks at this in more detail, including the implications for emissions but also mitigation opportunities. So for example, when this wasted gas is utilised, it can obviously help supplement energy needs that would otherwise come from things like imported gas that we've talked about. Thanks.
All right, thanks. I would like to bring in Dongje now. Dongje, when we talk about LNG and the associated risks, so the potential supply glut that Chris was talking about, it is being fueled by the availability of increased LNG carriers. And one of your report notes that it's increased massively from 2014, and it's at 970 ships currently. Do you think there is an oversupply in the system, and is there any stranded asset risk that could come along with that?
Yeah, thanks, Parva, for raising this and inviting us for the speaker. Yesterday, we had a similar side session at the meeting room in the, as the Christopher mentioned about the oversupply issues and such as the analysis from the IEEFA, this misalignment of supply and the demand started from the Russia's invasion of Ukraine after there is massive FID for the upstream projects. And we overlook what was the impact for the midstream LNG carrier shipping industry for this. But there has been also explosive, unprecedented LNG carrier orders made for the last 3 years, starting from 2021 to 2023. And now as all those LNG carriers are come to delivery from this year to the 2027 to 2028, we see the massive LNG carrier will also be in the oversupply risks. So we compare the IEA, current up-to-date IEA scenarios with the current ordered LNG carrier shipping capacity, and it shows that in 5 to 7 years, we will see 30% to 50% of LNG carrier shipping capacities oversupply issues. And we see that this would lead to massive stranded asset risk for not just for the shipbuilding industry, but for the shipping industry and the relevant financiers who already poured money into it. So considering the one LNG carrier costs about $300 million, it would be about like $80 billion in Korean shipyards, because now 80% of LNG carriers are being built in Korean shipyards right now, and 20% would go to the Chinese shipyards. So that's quite worrisome from our side, because Korean shipbuilding industry already have faced those kind of challenges about 10 years ago regarding the offshore oil and gas drilling and offshore production vessels. So at that time, there has been a lot of oil and gas drilling and the platform orders made when the oil gas price peaked in early 2010s, but the price went down and the ship owners didn't want to get it delivered, so they used the many loopholes of the contract to delay and cancel the ship orders for that. So that was quite led to the concession and the downturn for the shipbuilding industry of Korea, and it takes 10 years to get the recovery. So the risk that we see now for 3 to 5 years is that as the shipbuilding industry struggles with the stranded asset risk for the LNG carriers, they would lose the opportunity that's arising demand in the renewable energy industry because there's rising demand for the renewable energy offshore wind substructures and the orders for the wind turbine installation vessel to meet the global target for the renewable energy. So that's the kind of concern that we have in the Korean side. Thanks.
I think that is right. Every investment in fossil fuel is a lost opportunity for renewables, and that is something that we should remember. Like you mentioned about the challenges for the shipbuilding or the carrier fleet owner countries, what do you think this oversupply or the imminent oversupply, does it bring any challenges for the LNG importing countries as well?
Yeah, sorry. So oversupply of LNG carrier would add a lot of burden and financial losses to the shipping industry and the shipbuilding industry and financiers. But also that kind of oversupply from the supply side and the midstream side have also lead to the concern that this also would goes to some burst of demand for LNG in the downstream side. So even though Christopher said that there will be limited impact of the LNG price decrease, but we're really going into the uncertain market if there's a massive supply coming in and they compete with each other and to try to supply or try to sell those LNG to the market. So as we now see that many Korean and Japanese gas industry are trying to cultivate the demand in the demand of LNG in Southeast Asia and South Asian market, this kind of fuel price volatility in the decreasing side can also lead us to some uncertainty that there will be demand arising within 5 to 7 years from those markets.
All right, thanks. We'll just shift gears and we'll talk about the LNG to power and coal-based generation. I'd like to bring in Guy here. And Guy, when we talk about Asia's decarbonization plans, a major question that comes to mind is that about 60% of your electricity generation across Asia is still dependent on coal. We will be discussing the other alternatives during the course of this conference and in the other sessions, but I want to understand from you that what are the risks associated with this dependence on coal for electricity, and how does this hamper Asia's decarbonization plans?
Sure, thanks, Purva. I think the biggest problem now, short term, is that the coal price is halved. It's gone from about 240 to about 130 right now, and it's probably heading south. I think a lot of it is the last supply is coming out. A lot of it is people moving to renewables. So at the margin, the demand's coming down. But the real problem is that because it is cheaper, the coal plants are profitable. Right? So as you can see from our slide, new supply is actually quite limited. So you're going to have a situation where coal prices will have to go back up. And this is the best time to negotiate a closure of a coal plant. Because right now, coal plants are quite profitable because the coal price has halved. So if you have to try to negotiate with an owner to shut his plant down, he would be setting a high bar for any negotiations. So it's just very simple economics. But I think what we can do as a movement and as a united group is to continue the pressure on the financing side. Because even though coal prices go back $180, $200. If there's no financing and the companies get the message that emissions, methane emissions included, will be, exposed and, investors will know about the amount of emissions you contribute, then eventually, coal will get phased out. Eventually it will. And I guess that's part of our vision. Thank you.
And what do you think can be a good strategy for convincing financiers to stop investing in captive power plants? Like you mentioned that probably banks are not pouring in money for coal plants, but captive gets out of the taxonomy, which is a big problem. So what do you think a strategy that could work?
Well, if you have a whole bunch of angry investors, that actually helps. Because if investors just come out and say, look, this is a big problem for us, because, the range of emissions, I saw there was a slide on Indian steel, and it's 2.8, tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel for Indonesian nickel plants. The lowest is 28 tons per ton of nickel, and the highest is 70 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of nickel. It's a very high number. And if investors come up very clearly and say, look, unless you halve that in a very short time, we're not going to be giving you any financing. So I think decisive investors will help.
I think we're depending on the moral value of the investors at this point, which might not be a very safe strategy. But hopefully they will look at the economics as well. I think that was also discussed in the previous session, that even if you're, like Dr. Ghosh said, even if you're not a tree hugger, the economics are clear on that.
Yes, I do a bit of work on accounting side, accounting standards. And the good news is that in Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong, Indonesia too, are moving towards much more disclosures by next year on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So investors will know how much emissions your company emits. So that will definitely contribute to a very decisive investor response.
That's excellent news. So Chris, I would like to bring you in here. We are looking at LNG is being touted as the fuel for Asia. It's been looking to displace. There have been talks about displacing coal. How do you think the LNG to power feasibility looks for Asia? And do you think it can actually displace coal, or should it displace coal?
Yeah, so I guess anything could happen, but I would say it could be pretty expensive, that's my overall answer. But like I was talking about before, when you're getting into these Southeast Asian countries, you need governments to provide subsidies, or you need monetary reserves or end user ability through incomes or wealth to pay for this stuff. So LNG is about, I think right now, twice as expensive as coal, and it's a lot more volatile generally, which could create a lot of problems. So let's just use Bangladesh as an example again. So in 2018, they started to import LNG to make up for declining production. Some of that was used, to fuel power plants, sort of, I think, blending with, existing production. But around 2018, production, I think prices were oil indexed around $10 per barrel, the contracts they had. Spot prices were about the same. So that doesn't look too bad. And then through the pandemic, things got cheaper. And then enter 2022, though, the oil indexation. We have an energy crisis. The oil indexation price is around $13 per MMBTUs. And the spot prices are like $34 per MMBTU. Your currency starts depreciating about 22%. That's like double the cost per unit for what you were doing before. So that doesn't look too good anymore. And then I think Petrobangla basically was unable to pay its import bills for LNG and other energy. Started to turn to external financing, the IMF. Well, with the IMF comes austerity, and austerity isn't cheap. They start to tell you what you need to spend your money on, how you need to, what you need to do for prices. So yeah, we've seen, I think, we have some research on this from the South Asia team, but I believe the gas tariffs have increased by 3 times over the last year, and the electricity tariffs are scheduled to go up in line with the fuel costs, which is basically LNG costs over the next 2 years, I think every quarter. So it's very expensive. And sorry, I'll just try to conclude by saying I think what Vietnam and other emerging adopters are thinking is they're looking at that and going, well, that's kind of scary. as governments, we don't really want to guarantee, that we could fund these sort of volatile price swings so that counterparties, meaning investors in the power plants and the utilities, EVN, will agree on PPAs to facilitate these developments.
And how do you think the outlook for LNG looks when you look at the proposition of LNG replacing the declining domestic gas production in a lot of Asian economies?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't expecting that one. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a drive in the region, but like I'm saying, I mean, that's Shell's region. One of Shell's reasons why they see, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, sort of ramping up their LNG imports is because of this, the decline narrative. So I think it depends, again, on, I think my previous answer sort of still applies. It depends on your ability, if your government, your fiscal coffers, your monetary reserves, and your wealth to sort of pay for that. And I think what we're learning, through Bangladesh or even Thailand is that if you look at Thailand, they've been doing this for a while, with their declining imports from Myanmar and declining domestic production. They're sort of seeing, I believe their utilities sort of said, well, we can't really keep subsidizing this going forward. Like, we're going to need, this can't be sustainable. So I don't really think it's a sustainable thing to do. And I think that's what countries are learning.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and the price volatility and the general volatility that gas has displayed, even despite the, even before the pandemic or the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I think that adds to this whole narrative of not considering LNG as a dependable fuel, especially to replace your domestic productions. Thank you. I'd like to bring in Dongjae here, because when we talk about gas to power, we see that Korean public financiers are also reviewing financial support for Southeastern Asia's gas expansion, such as Vietnam and Thailand. The Korea gas industry is spearheading this initiative. As Korea's financial support for international fossil fuel projects ranks second largest among G20 countries, what concerns can be raised in the Asian regional transition?
Yeah, so we see similar landscape for the coal expansion in Southeast Asia and South Asian countries. East Asian countries were built up carbon-intensive economy based on the coal power plants. As their coal demand increase is phasing down or slowing down, they try to export their facilities to Southeast Asian market backed by public financiers. That's from the Korea and Japan and also to the China. And the thing here is that sometimes it goes beyond the rational choices. So even though the price of the coal power plant is expensive, they just try to sell it because that directly links to the survival of their industry, coal industry in Korea, Japan. So that was the story that we saw from the coal fight. But at the gas fight, we also see the similar one because Korea coal gas is the world's largest capacity company with the largest capacity. And there's JERA, Osaka Gas, and Tokyo Gas in Japan, who also marks the in the highest rank for the import terminals facility. So as the Korea and Japan gas demand expected to go down, now they're trying to build up their demands in the Southeast Asian market. So that's the dynamic that we see, and the public financiers of Korea, Japan are trying to support those financings. And one of the hilarious point that we captured last year is that one of the National Assembly members in Korea exposed a document that submitted from CAPCO, who are also trying to cooperate with KOGAS on the GTP project. So they expected the LCOE of gas power plant is expensive than coal and is twice expensive than renewable energy. So even with their internal review that gas is the most expensive one or the option for those markets, they're spearheading with that project. And their response was that we can make it profitable because we can sell the electricity in quite high price. So we saw we saw the price of the PPA contract value that they are estimating, which was 70% higher than reference coal PPA contract for the Vietnam market. So this is quite high, and most of the price are made up by the import terminal, because import terminal is quite capital intensive one, and most of the Southeast Asian market do not have the abundant import terminal capacity yet, because now they're trying to expand it. So those kind of capital intensive feature of the GTP projects are making those gas expansion less competitive compared to the renewable energy. So, but we're still concerned that as this goes beyond the rational choices of all stakeholders, this could just end up delivering just price bomb for the electricity market payers in the Vietnamese and the other Southeast Asian countries. So that would be the concern that if those kind of ambition that gas industries of Korea, Japan are trying to make up in the Southeast Asian market visualized, that would end up another risks that Southeast Asian power market would face that they faced 2 to 3 years ago regarding the coal price spike.
Understood. And of course, this intensive support of the Korean finances, public finances for LNG carriers is not, like you said, not the most rational choice and not a very efficient utilization of public finance as well. Do you think there are any lessons that can be learned for the Asian countries from other developed countries like France, Canada, and UK, who cease to finance new fossil fuel infrastructure or are enhancing financing in clean energy?
Yeah, I see the energy transition narrative now dominating overall Asia is coming from Europe's stories that using gas as the bridge fuel from coal to renewable energy. That may make sense when it's about the energy market in 20s and 2010s or early 2010s, because renewable energy at that time didn't secure the price compatibility compared to coal or gas. But the lessons from the developed countries is that we should choose the most rational or competent power sources at that time. And in 2024, the data shows that renewable energy is the most competent sources compared to coal or gas or fossil fuels. The most, maybe it will be just the political wills and the ambition to cut the path dependency of the industry and the public finance who are trying to back in those industries. So in other words, we can say that there's abundant capacity that Korean, Japanese public financiers could ramp up their clean energy financing into those markets, because they're industry who can compete with the Chinese renewable energy industry and the battery business. And in those competing structure, there might be opportunity for both countries, and also countries in Southeast Asia could seek the opportunity to accelerate their decarbonization pathways. So yeah, I think I can put it that way.
Yeah, I think that is, and you've rightly pointed out that using the term gas as a bridge fuel is probably a 20-year-old story. Eleanor, a similar question to you. What do you think can be learned from the approach that other countries are taking on methane emissions from the energy sector? For example, we see Australia bringing in the safeguard mechanism, and EU has come on a new regulation on methane emissions. What impact do you think is this expected to have on the Asian economies?
Yeah, thank you. We've talked about investment risks, and actually I think in the case of Australia, the coal mine methane issue is also a policy risk. So we did research that found that in Australia, a shift to company-led emissions reporting, but without verification, meant that overnight hundreds of thousands of carbon dioxide equivalent in the form of methane were erased, but without any mitigation or change in coal mining. So it shows that without improvements of the kind of framework of methane measurement and verification, policy shifts that seem kind of fine on the surface can actually end up having a profound impact on short-term warming. And this is because not enough is understood about coal mine methane, and I wish I could say it was the elephant in the room, but we're a long way off it being even that. But actually in Australia, they've recently made announcements which could help steer the country back on course for better methane measurements. And these include setting up an expert panel that will look at how to improve top-down measurements through technologies like satellites, formally reviewing company-led reporting, and also funding a study that will help develop standard methane measurement methodology. And you mentioned the EU methane regulation, and this boasts some of the strongest requirements globally for monitoring and reporting methane emissions from coal mines, but also includes a strong focus on measurement and mitigation at both closed and abandoned mines. And this affects countries in Asia because any countries that export to the EU need to have equivalents for this monitoring, reporting and verification, but also be within a maximum methane intensity. And at the moment, none of the 10 biggest countries that export coal to the EU currently meet that monitoring, reporting or verification standard, and that includes Australia. So what this does show is that obviously countries would benefit from lesson sharing and also international cooperation on coal mine methane and methane emissions more generally.
All right, thank you. Ki, I would like to bring you in. I'll ask you an easy question. Do you think there is an economic argument for coal phase down? And what do you think the role government policies and coal companies can play in that?
Sure. I think the economic argument for coal phase down becomes strongest when the coal price is very high, and for inflationary reasons, the utilities, public utilities, do not want to raise their power price, right? So when that happens, coal power plants start to lose money because the price of coal would be way above what they're getting from the power tariffs. So that's the best time to strike. How can governments help? Just refuse to increase the power price, you know? You say that, you know, we're going for an election, for example, and people, you know, CPI is running hot, so let's not do this. And how can coal companies contribute to phase out of coal? Is to diversify into non-coal businesses. So Harum has got a nickel smelter. Adaro is going to aluminum smelter. They've already promised that for the third phase, they're going to do hydropower. They're looking at renewables for the second phase. So I think the Indonesian companies in this case here, they do get the message from the market that expanding coal capacity is not popular. So they're looking to diversify into, you know, other sort of spaces. So that would help. And I think for us as investors and participants, stakeholders, we just emphasize that high emissions are not acceptable. New coal capacity is not acceptable, and we also encourage governments to not increase coal power tariffs. Thank you.
So I think I'll just take one or two more questions from the Hoover app that people have been asking. Chris, there's a question which says that we often hear that natural gas is a transition fuel. What advice do you have to investors to help determine when this is true or when is this transition washing?
I think some of the experiences that I've already explained would say for the power sector, it's certainly, I guess as you said, transition washing. You know, it's a pretty expensive alternative. It could actually instill energy insecurity into your economy and actually derail your entire, you know, sort of economic well-being, livelihood. When you have outages, you know, your system operators need to pick winners and losers about which industries get to stay on, who gets, you know, to stay cool, that sort of thing. So, again, back to the whole liquid fuel displacement, perhaps LNG is a transition fuel when it comes to liquid fuels. I say that because, you know, I talked a bit about how LNG is competitive with diesel when it comes to heavy-duty vehicles and LPG with, you know, city gas networks and industry. But Wood Mackenzie sort of had this argument that by about 2030, batteries and basically heavy-duty vehicles using batteries should start to become cost competitive with these new LNG fueled vehicles that are coming out of China. So really that transition might be very short. So yeah, I think that covers it.
So I think we have the last 5 minutes, and I'll maybe ask one question to all of you, and feel free to answer, as per your subject expertise. What policy levers do you think the Asian countries can use to meet their energy needs while ensuring that they stay committed on the decarbonization pathway? So we can start with Eleanor, maybe?
I didn't want to start, but okay. Yeah, so I think just in the case of, obviously I'm focusing on coal mine methane emissions, and I think I've mentioned that if we understood them better and considered them appropriately, it's another reason that we should be pushing investment in renewables rather than coal. But also, I think lessons can be learned from other countries where they are starting to take it seriously, and you've mentioned the EU methane regulation. I think in this case, there does need to be more regulation to ensure that proper measurements of these types of emissions are happening so that they are appropriately reflected in investment decisions and mitigation plans and net zero strategies. And yeah, I think in that case, it's kind of learning from those kinds of regulations that have been brought in other countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Guy?
Sure. On the accounting disclosure side, get the local regulator to really put the onus on companies to disclose their emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, as soon as possible, as soon as 2025. And in terms of power tariff pricing, try as much as possible to not increase coal power tariffs, and especially when coal prices are going up, so you motivate investors to move out of these assets. And also, as they keep coal tariffs low, try to subsidize renewable tariffs so as to encourage capital to flow towards wind and solar.
Yeah, I would say in one sentence, I would say multiple implementation of economy-wide industrial and physical policies in Asian countries. So we see how trajectory get differentiated in US and EU after their industrial policy, IRA, and the EU's Carbon Neutrality Act has implemented. And also we are seeing Australia is coming up with their own industrial policy. And as I said, regional gas industry's ambition to expansion overrides the regional choices, and this cannot be tackled or solved without other initiatives of political willingness to tackle this and transition toward the decarbonized society. And Korea, Japan, China have potential to compete with that initiatives because they already have an experience of competing on the coal expansion policies and the carbon neutrality pledges in 2020 and 2021. So we see the opportunity lies ahead of us that those countries compete with each other on the clean energy financing and the clean energy industry. And as they cooperate with the Southeast Asian market, we can make that another trajectory can be created, which is enormously cutting the greenhouse gas emissions arose from the gas and the remaining coal in those markets.
Yeah, so I'm not going to prescribe any policy, but I would say, there is some pressure, as Donjay mentioned, for Japan and maybe a bit of Korea too, for cultivating LNG demand, across Asia. And I'd say just try to be skeptical and look around at what's happening to the countries in the region that have been doing that, and look at the problems that happened, and think about, do you want those problems, or what would you do differently if you really need LNG? And do you need it actually for base load? You know, maybe there's some other pathways. So I just say, yeah, just try to have a healthy dose of skepticism of its role in the energy transition. That's it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like Asia has many examples to look up to instead of just following them blindly. It should create its own pathway. That's what we need. So with that, we'll bring the session to a close. There are some questions on the Whova app for the panelists, so please do respond to them when you find the time and if you wish like. And we'll move on to the next session after this. Thank you all for joining.